Hello and welcome to another episode of World of Africa. Coming to you from Durban, South Africa, I'm Alyson Grange. It's a week of firsts. Kenya played host to the first climate summit ever to be held on the continent, and G20 will become G21 with the inclusion of the African Union in the group. And that's where we kick off the show this week. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's wish to have the continent be included in the group of 20 nations has finally paid off. The addition is a boost for the continent's role in geopolitics and an enhancement to the global south. Let's find out why this was a priority for this year's G20 presidency, India, and what it means for the 55 African nations. Our correspondent, Louisa Olaniyi, reports.
It started off as a proposal late last year. Efforts to include the African continent in global forums such as the G7 or the United Nations Security Council have been lengthy. But Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi made it his clarion call to champion the inclusion of the African Union at the G20.
Friends, वैसे तो B20 के थीम रेंज में आई है। आई इनोवेशन को रिप्रेजेंट करता है, लेकिन मैं इसमें इनोवेशन के साथ ही एक और आई को भी देखता हूं, और ये आई है इंक्लूसिवनेस। हमने अफ्रीकन यूनियन को भी G20 की स्थायी सदस्यता के लिए इस विजन के साथ इनवाइट किया।
Days ahead of the summit, Prime Minister Modi said that Africa is a top priority for G20 and that no future plan of Earth can succeed without all voices being heard. Proponents argue that African Union, a bloc of 55 nations inclusion, would make the G20 more representative and thereby boost its credibility. The G20, which currently represents 65% of the world's population, would then speak for about 80% of global citizens. The AU has already announced that its representation in the G20 would be led by its current chairperson, assisted by the AU Commission chairperson. Meanwhile, Nigeria, the chair of West African Nations bloc ECOWAS, is considering applying to become a member of the G20. Its president, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, will be leading a delegation to New Delhi and will meet India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi on the sidelines of the summit.
His Excellency, Mr. President, will be meeting with the President of Brazil, President da Silva. He will be meeting with the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. He will be meeting with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He will be meeting with the South Korean President Yeol, and a few other heads of state on the sidelines of the G20.
By the kind of policy that we make with these foreign groups and organizations, such that it will be a win-win for everybody at the end of the day, both in terms of technology, IT, infrastructure, and medical technology and other businesses that they can partner with us.
With over 20 technocrats, industrialists, and billionaire businessmen from major sector of the Nigerian economy, President Tinubu departs for the G20 summit in India today. This is as Nigeria looks forward to joining her South African counterpart in aligning with the world's 20 most industrialized nations. Experts believe Nigeria's membership is long overdue as the giant of Africa. According to the president's spokesperson, Tinubu will at the summit highlight Nigeria's attractiveness as an investment destination, specifically outlining his cross-sectoral reform plan as encapsulated by the Renewed Hope agenda.
Once it becomes G21, not only will the voice of Africa be heard globally, but India's leadership of the independent axis of the global south will play an even greater pivotal role in the new world order. With inputs from Louisa Olaniyi in Nigeria, Africa Bureau, WION World is One.
In response to the recent surge in coup attempts across the African continent, some leaders are taking proactive measures by restructuring their defense portfolios. President Paul Biya of Cameroon implemented significant changes within the country's Ministry of Defense. President Paul Kagame of Rwanda approved the retirement of 83 senior officers, simultaneously authorizing the promotion and appointment of new officers to fill the vacated positions. These reshufflements have taken place after the Gabon coup, reflecting the heightened concerns among African leaders about political stability and security in the region.
He staged a coup and within days was sworn in as transitional president of the latest African nation to join the list of coups, Gabon.
Je m'engage solennellement.
I solemnly undertake to spare no effort to ensure that at the end of this transition, our country, Gabon, has strong, democratic and credible institutions.
D'institutions fortes, démocratiques et crédibles.
Brice Oligui Nguema toppled Gabon's 55-year-old ruling dynasty, the Bongo family, just moments after Ali Bongo was proclaimed victor in presidential elections. But nobody ever thought that a coup would befall the tiny Central African country. With coups already taking their course in West Africa, particularly in the Sahel, leaders are now alarmed. President Paul Kagame of Rwanda, who has been in power since 2000, has approved the retirement of hundreds of soldiers, including some prominent figures from the 1994 Liberation War. At the same time, he has promoted several young officers to the rank of colonel and appointed new generals. Following Rwanda's footsteps is President Paul Biya of Cameroon, who's been in power since 1982. Biya also made new appointments within the Defense Ministry. The announcement was made without specifying any reason. 90-year-old Biya has faced health issues and has not shown any intention of stepping down or grooming a successor. His regime has been accused of human rights violations and corruption and has faced armed separatist movements in the Anglophone regions. The moves by Rwanda and Cameroon come amid a wave of coups in Africa this year, which have toppled governments in Chad, Mali, Guinea, Sudan, Ethiopia and Gabon. There are several African leaders who have held on to power for at least 2 decades. Yoweri Museveni of Uganda ruled for 37 years. Teodoro Obasanjo of Equatorial Guinea ruled for 44 years. Isaias Afwerki of Eritrea ruled for 30 years. And Ismail Omar Guelleh of Djibouti ruled for 24 years. Across the coup belt states, citizens have jubilantly trooped out in large numbers to welcome the putschists. The perception of widespread and worsening corruption is particularly corrosive, leaving people increasingly dissatisfied with political systems. And although citizens find myriad ways to voice their concerns, they feel that their governments are not listening. One hopes that the coup fever fizzles away soon. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
The wave of violence just doesn't seem to end in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The United Nations has demanded an independent probe after dozens of people were killed in a crackdown on an anti-UN protest in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC. At least 222 people were reportedly arrested, including women and children. And the agency warned that the risk of human rights violations in such a charged context is high. Here's a report.
The aftermath was evident on the streets of Goma. Over 40 people dead and dozens injured in clashes between protesters from a religious sect and the armed forces. Nearly 160 people were arrested during the violence.
People have been killed all over, but the authorities are saying nothing. Like in Rutshuru. If only the soldiers who are killing us would fight the enemy and not kill unarmed civilians. The president should do something about this.
The protest was organized by a sect called the Natural Judaic and Messianic Faith towards the nations and known colloquially as Wazalendo. Its supporters were protesting against the regional East African Community Organization and the United Nations peacekeeping mission in Congo, which is in the process of being drawn down by the end of the year. Concerned over the use of force by the authorities, the United Nations demanded a probe.
People have a right to express themselves freely and assemble peacefully, even if in protest against the United Nations and other actors. Authorities must facilitate the right to peaceful assembly.
According to Human Rights Watch, an advocacy group, the events of that fateful day were an apparent massacre.
It's
a crime against humanity because they kill people in a church, and churches are protected spaces under international law. But they kill them there and others in their homes and unarmed people.
Ils ont tué les gens se trouvant dans ces églises-là.
We were just about to start marching, and suddenly we saw armed Congolese soldiers coming and immediately opening fire on the people and on the Wazalendo who were there. That was when I got hit by a bullet too.
Eastern DRC has been ravaged by militia violence for 3 decades. A legacy of regional wars that fled in the 1990s and 2000s. The United Nations peacekeeping mission there is one of the largest and costliest in the world, with an annual budget of about $1 billion. But the force, known by its initials as MONUSCO, is often criticized locally, with many people saying it is too passive about preventing conflict. Last year, dozens were killed in anti-United Nations protests, including 4 peacekeepers. The latest violence coincides with a debate over when the force should leave the country. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
The inaugural Africa Climate Summit kicked off in Nairobi, Kenya, with the continent seeking to change the narrative around climate change. The summit aimed to develop a common African position ahead of a UN climate conference next month in New York and the COP28 summit in the United Arab Emirates in November. African countries are disproportionately bearing the brunt of climate change, despite contributing the least to global emissions. Here's a report.
This week was big for Kenya. It played host as leaders gathered in capital Nairobi for the first Africa Climate Summit. The leaders aim to highlight the continent that will suffer the most from climate change while contributing the least. The 3-day meet had things set on the agenda. African leaders are uniting ahead of the United Nations Climate Conference, and on top of their to-do list is climate funding. The Nairobi meeting is billed as bringing together leaders from the 54-nation continent to define a shared vision of Africa's green development, an ambitious aim in a politically and economically diverse region whose communities are among the most vulnerable to climate change.
The possibilities are not just promising, they are transformative. Africa can power all our energy needs with renewable resources. The continent has enough potential to be entirely self-sufficient with the mixture of wind, solar, geothermal, sustainable biomass, and hydropower. In Africa, we can be a green industrial hub that helps other regions achieve their net zero strategies by 2050.
But as the forum kicked off, significant investment in Africa's adaptation to climate change, including better forecasting, will be an urgent goal. At the heart of every issue on the agenda, from energy to agriculture, is the lack of data collection that drives decisions as crucial as when to plant and when to flee. The African continent is larger than China, India and the United States combined, and yet Africa has just 37 radar facilities for tracking weather, an essential tool along with satellite data and surface monitoring according to a World Meteorological Organization database. Europe, in comparison, has 354 radar facilities, while North America has 291.
So the continent is really at a crossroad, and while it emits less than 4% of global emissions, as we've said, it is going to be the most affected, and it is already the most affected, for instance, through water events, be them floods or droughts.
The widespread inability to track and forecast the weather affects key development choices. Kenya, the host of the climate summit, is one of the very few countries in Africa seen as having a relatively well-developed weather service. The others are South Africa and Morocco. Kenya has allocated about $12 million this year for its meteorological service, according to the National Treasury. A small figure when compared to the US National Weather Service budget request for this year, which was $1.3 billion. The vast expanse of the 54-nation African continent is relatively unserved and unwarned.
We have ample renewable energy potential as well, and the natural assets and resources to green our own consumption, but also to meaningfully contribute to decarbonization of the global economy. We must see in green growth not just a climate imperative, but also a fountain of multi-billion-dollar economic opportunities that Africa and the world is primed to capitalize.
And because of a lack of funding, the number of observations by atmospheric devices usually used with weather balloons decreased by as much as 50% over Africa between 2015 and 2020. Experts have raised concern over the lack of monitoring, while some have even called Africa a climate risk blind spot because of the same.
And more efforts, therefore, are needed locally and internationally to support adaptation to climate change, to invest in climate solution. And there is really an opportunity with the summit that takes place this week and next to accelerate action, to really deliver the financial commitments that have been made since years, so that we can build this rapid and essential impact needed in the next decade.
At present, fewer than 20% of sub-Saharan African countries provide reliable weather services. But things are slowly moving in the right direction. 13 of the most data-sparse African countries, including Ethiopia, Madagascar and Congo, are getting money to improve weather data collection and sharing from a United Nations-created trust fund. The systematic observations financing facility, an older funding mechanism with many of the same partners, climate risk and early warning systems, has supported modernizing meteorological systems in a half-dozen West and Central African countries. And it's not just forecasting. As climate shocks, such as Somalia's worst drought in decades, become more common, better recording of weather data is a critical need for decision making. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
And finally, chronic electricity shortages have shaped the daily lives of Libyans since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in a NATO-backed 2011 uprising.
It's midnight just before the weekend. Traffic snarls the Corniche in Tripoli, where improved electricity service has brought renewed energy to Libya's capital after years of conflict and power cuts. Chronic electricity shortages had shaped the daily lives of Libyans since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in a NATO-backed 2011 uprising. What followed was a decade of sporadic fighting between rival armed groups, and to make matters worse, looting incidents skyrocketed across the North African country. But things have turned around for the better. The security situation stabilized. There was also a management change at the GCOL, short for General Electricity Company of Libya. In June 2022, Prime Minister Abdelhamid Dbeibah took over as the chairman of the state firm. And since then, Libyan electricity supply has seen a shift like no other.
It's clear that administrative stability within the GCOL has contributed to the stability of the power network. There is also military stability, and we have not experienced any wars or political crises within this year.
Libya earlier had no power for almost half the day. People had adapted to reality. They stocked up on batteries worth hundreds of dinars. This was the only way to have some light in their homes. It also helped them with a running Wi-Fi connection, while those with access to money purchased fuel-guzzling generators to light up their homes.
Before, we used to suffer a lot with the power cuts as we couldn't just sell customers spoiled meat. But now, things are much better. Customers buy fresh and clean meat and there's always air conditioning.
The electricity supply has improved countrywide, although the boost to Tripolis was the most dramatic and significant. Electricity network stability is the foundation of the Return to Life campaign launched by the city government and is slowly restoring Tripolis' soul. Residents proudly nickname their city Siren of the Mediterranean for its attractive seafront. Libyan electricity rates are among the lowest in the region at 0.050 dinars, almost a cent per kilowatt hour for individuals, and 0.20 dinars for businesses.
There's a significant and clear improvement from previous years in the electric network. Yet, there are still some issues related to strengthening the electrical grid, among other minor things. But thank God, there's such an improvement in comparison with past years.
The authorities are cautious. Even one incident of unrest can cause thousands of dollars worth of infrastructure damage. Undo what has been achieved with hard work. Just last month, clashes between two militias using rocket launchers and machine guns killed 55 people. It was Tripoli's worst unrest in more than a year. Still, the lights shining in Tripoli's Medina and silhouetting the adjacent Red Castle, a 16th century fortress built by the Spanish, symbolizing hope for a brighter future. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Thank you for watching this week's episode. Share your feedback with us, and if you have a story idea that you want told on the show, then get in touch with us on our social media platforms. We'd love hearing from you. I'm Alyson Grange, and from the entire WION team in India and here in South Africa, goodbye and see you next time.